The Lord of the World, Part 11, Chapter 2, Part 1. At 23 o'clock that night, the Syrian priest went out to watch for the coming of the messenger from Tiberias. Nearly 2 hours previously he had heard the cry of the Russian volor that plied from Damascus to Tiberias, and Tiberias to Jerusalem, and even as it was, the messenger was a little late. These were very primitive arrangements, but Palestine was out of the world, a slip of useless country, and it was necessary for a man to ride from Tiberias to Nazareth each night with papers from the Cardinal Corcoran to the Pope, and to return with correspondence. It was a dangerous task, and the members of the new order who surrounded the cardinal undertook it by turns. In this manner all matters for which the Pope's personal attention was required, which were too long and not too urgent, could be dealt with at leisure by him, and an answer returned within 24 hours. It was a brilliant, moonlit night. The great golden shield was rising high above Tabor, shedding its strange metallic light down the long slopes and over the moor-like country that rose up from before the house door, casting two heavy black shadows that seemed far more concrete and solid than the brilliant pale surfaces of the rock slabs, or even than the diamond flashes from the quartz and crystal that here and there sparkled up the stony pathway. Compared with this clear splendor, the yellow light from the shuttered house seemed a hot and tawdry thing, and the priest, leaning against the doorpost, his eyes alone alight in the dark face, sat down at last with a kind of eastern sensuousness, to bathe himself in the glory, and to spread his lean brown hands out to it. This was a very simple man, in faith as well as in life. For him there were neither the ecstasies nor the desolations of his master. It was an immense and solemn joy to him to live here at the spot of God's incarnation, and in attendance upon his vicar. As regards the movements of the world, he observed them as a man in a ship watches the heaving of the waves far beneath. Of course the world was restless, he half perceived, for, as the Latin doctor had said, all hearts were restless until they found their rest in God. Quare fremerunt gentes? Adversus Dominum, adversus Christum ejus. As to the end, he was not greatly concerned. It might well be that the ship would be overwhelmed, but the moment of the catastrophe would be the end of all things earthly. The gates of hell shall not prevail. When Rome falls, the world falls, and when the world falls, Christ is manifest in power. For himself, he imagined that the end was not far away. When he had named Megiddo after this afternoon, after it had been on his mind, to him it seemed natural that at the consummation of all things, Christ's vicar should dwell at Nazareth where his king had come on earth, and that the Armageddon of the divine John should be within sight of the scene where Christ had first taken his earthly scepter, and should take it again. After all, it would not be the first battle that Megiddo had seen. Israel and Amalek had met there, Israel and Assyria. Sesostris had ridden there, and Sennacherib. Christian and Turk had contended there, like Michael and Satan, over the place where God's body had lain, and to the exact method of that kind he had no clear views. It would be a battle of some kind, and what field could be found more evidently designed for that than his huge flat circular plain of Estralen, 20 miles across, sufficient to hold all the armies of the earth in its embrace. To his view, once more, ignorant as he was of present statistics, the world was divided into two large sections, Christians and heathens, and he supposed them very much of a size. Something would happen. Troops would land at Kepha. They would stream southwards from Tiberias, Damascus, and remote Asia, northwards from Jerusalem, Egypt and Africa, eastwards from Europe, westwards from Asia again in the far-off Americas. And surely the time could not be far away, for here was Christ's vicar. And, as he himself had said in his Gospel of the Advent, ubicumque feruit corpus, illi congratibuntur et aquilae. Of more subtle interpretations of prophecy he had no knowledge. For him words were things, not merely labels upon ideas. What Christ and St. Paul and St. John had said, these things were so. He had escaped, owing chiefly to his isolation from the world, and that vast expansion of ritulant ideas that during the last century had been responsible for the desertion by so many of any intelligible creed. For others, this had been the supreme struggle, the difficulty of decision between the facts that words were not things, and yet that the things they represented were in themselves objective. But to this man, sitting now in the moonlight, listening to the far-off taps of hoofs over the hill as the messenger came up from Cana, faith was as simple as an exact science. Here Gabriel had descended on wide feathered wings from the throne of God to set beyond the stars. The Holy Ghost had breathed in a beam of ineffable light. The Word had become flesh as Mary folded her arms and bowed her head to the decree of the Eternal. And here, once more, he thought, though it was no more than a guess, yet he thought that already the running of chariot wheels was audible, the tumult of the hosts of God gathered about the camp of the saints. He thought that already beyond the bars of the dark, Gabriel set to his lips the trumpet of doom, and heaven was astir. He might be wrong at this time, as others had been wrong at other times, but neither he nor they could be wrong forever. There must be some day be an end to the patience of God, even though that patience sprang from the eternity of his nature. He stood up, as down the pale moonlit path 100 yards away came a pale figure of one who rode, with a leather bag strapped to his girdle. Part 2. It would be about 3 o'clock in the morning that the priest awoke in his little mud-walled room next to that of the Holy Fathers, and heard a footstep coming up the stairs. Last evening he had left his master as usual, beginning to open the pile of letters arrived from Cardinal Cochrane, and he himself had gone straight to his bed and slept. He lay now a moment or two, still drowsy, listening to the pad of feet, and an instant later sat up abruptly, for a deliberate tap had sounded on the door. Again it came, And he sprang out of bed in his long night tunic, drew it up hastily in his girdle, and went to the door and opened it. The Pope was standing there, with a little lamp in one hand, for the dawn had scarcely yet begun, and a paper in the other. "I beg your pardon, Father, but there is a message I must have sent at once to His Eminence." Together they went out through the Pope's room. The priest, still half blind with sleep, passed up the stairs and emerged into the clear, cold air of the upper roof. The Pope blew out his lamp and set it on the parapet. "You will be cold, Father. Fetch your cloak. And you, Holiness?" The other made a little gesture of denial and went across to the tiny temporary shed where the wireless telegraphic instrument stood. "Fetch your cloak, Father," he said again over his shoulder. "I will ring up meanwhile." When the priest came back 3 minutes later, in his slippers and cloak, carrying another cloak also for his master, the Pope was still seated at the table. He did not even move his head as the other came up, but once more pressed on the lever that, communicating with the 12-foot pole that rose through the penthouse overhead, shot out the quivering energy through the 80 miles of glimmering air that lay between Nazareth and Damascus. This simple priest had scarcely even, by now, become accustomed to this extraordinary device, invented a century ago, and perfected through all those years to the precise exactness, that device by which, with the help of a stick, a bundle of wires, and a box of wheels, something, at last established to be at the root of all matter, if not at the very root of physical life, spoke across the spaces of the world to a tiny receiver tuned by a hair's breadth to the vibration with which it was set in relations. The air was surprisingly cold, considering the heat that had preceded and would follow it, and the priest shivered a little as he stood clear on the roof and stared, now at the motionless figure in the chair before him, now at the vast vault of the sky passing, even as he looked, from a cold, colorless luminosity to a tender tint of yellow, as far away beyond Tabor and Moab the dawn began to deepen. From the village half a mile away rose the crowing of a cock, thin and brazen as a trumpet. A dog barked once and was silent again, and then, on a sudden, a single stroke upon a bell hung in the roof recalled him in an instant and told him that his work was to begin. The Pope pressed the lever again at the sound, twice, and then, after a pause, once more, waiting a moment for an answer, and when it came, rose and signed it to the priest to take his place. The Syrian sat down, handing the extra cloak to his master, and waited until the other had settled himself in a chair in such a position at the side of the table that the face of each was visible to the other. Then he waited, with his brown fingers poised above the row of keys, looking at the other's face as he arranged himself to speak. That face, he thought, looking out from the hood, seemed paler than ever in this cold light of dawn. The black arched eyebrows accentuated this, and even the steady lips, preparing to speak, seemed white and bloodless. He had a paper in his hand, and his eyes were fixed upon this. "Make sure it is the cardinal," he said abruptly. The priest tapped off an inquiry, and, with moving lips, read off the printed message. As like magic, it precipitated itself on to the tall white sheet of paper that faced him. "It is His Eminence, Holiness," he said softly. "He is alone at the instrument." "Very well. Now then, begin." "We have received your Eminence's letter, and have noted the news. It should have been forwarded by telegraphy. Why was that not done before?" The voice paused, and the priest who snapped off the message, more quickly than a man could write it, read aloud the answer. "I did not understand that it was urgent. I thought it was but one more assault. I had intended to communicate more, so as soon as I heard more." "Of course it was urgent," came the voice again in the deliberate intonation that was used between the two in the case of messages for transmission. "Remember that all news of this kind is always urgent." "I will remember," said the priest. "I regret my mistake." "You tell us," went on the Pope, his eyes still downcast on the paper, "that this measure is decided upon. You name only 3 authorities. Give me, now, all the authorities you have, if you have more." There was a moment's pause. Then the priest began to read off the names. "Besides the 3 cardinals whose names I sent, the archbishops of Tibet, Cairo, Calcutta, and Sydney have all asked if the news was true, and for directions if it is true. Besides others whose names I can communicate if I may leave the table for a moment." "Do so," said the Pope. Again there was a pause. Then once more the names began. "The bishops of Bucharest, the Marquise Islands, and Newfoundland, the Franciscans in Japan, the Crutched Friars in Morocco, the Archbishops of Manitoba and Portland, and the Cardinal Archbishop of Beijing. I have dispatched 2 members of Christ crucified to England." "Tell us when the news arrived first, and how." "I was called up to the instrument yesterday evening at about 20 o'clock. The Bishop of Sydney was asking, through our station at Bombay, whether the news was true. I replied I had heard nothing of it. Within 10 minutes 4 more inquiries had come to the same effect, and 3 minutes later Cardinal Ruspoli sent the positive news from Turin. This was accompanied by a similar message from Father Petrovsky in Moscow. Then, stop. Why did not Cardinal Dolgorovsky communicate it?" "He did communicate it 3 hours later." "Why not at once?" "His Eminence had not heard it." "Find out at what hour the news reached Moscow. Not now, but within the day." "I will." "Go on, then." "Cardinal Malpas communicated it within 5 minutes of Cardinal Ruspoli, and the rest of the inquiries arrived before midnight. China reported it at 23. Then when do you suppose the news was made public?" "It was decided first at the secret London conference, yesterday, at about 16 o'clock by our time. The plenipotentiaries appeared to have signed it at that hour. After that it was communicated to the world. It was published here a half hour past midnight." "Then Felsenburgh was in London." I am not yet sure. Cardinal Malpas tells me that Felsenburgh gave his provisional consent on the previous day. Very good. That is all you know, then? I was called up an hour ago by Cardinal Ruspoli again. He tells me that he fears a riot in Florence. It will be the first of many revolutions, he says. Does he ask for anything? Only for directions. Tell him that we send him the apostolic benediction, and will forward directions within the course of 2 hours. Select 12 members of the order for immediate service. I will. Communicate that message also, as soon as we have finished, to all the Sacred College, and bid them communicate it with all discretion to all the metropolitans and bishops, that priests and people may know that we bear them in our heart. I will, Holiness. Tell them, finally, that we had foreseen this long ago, that we commend them to the Eternal Father, without whose providence no sparrow falls to the ground. Bid them be quiet and confident, to do nothing, save confess their faiths when they are questioned. All other directions shall be issued to their pastors immediately. I will, Holiness. There was again a pause. The Pope had been speaking with the utmost tranquillity as one in a dream. His eyes were downcast upon the paper, his whole body as motionless as an image. Yet to the priest who listened, dispatching the Latin messages, and reading aloud the replies, it seemed, although so little intelligible news had reached him, as if something very strange and great was impending. There was the sense of a peculiar strain in the air, and although he drew no deductions from the fact that apparently the whole Catholic world was in frantic communication with Damascus, yet he remembered his meditations of the evening before he had waited for the messenger. It seemed as if the powers of this world were contemplating one more step. With its nature he was not greatly concerned. The Pope spoke again in his natural voice. Father, he said, what I am about to say now is as if I told it in confession. You understand? Very well. Now begin. Then again the intonation began. Eminence, we shall say Mass of the Holy Ghost in 1 hour from now. At the end of that time you will cause all that the Sacred College shall be in touch with yourself, and waiting for our commands. This new decision is unlike any that have preceded it. Surely you understand that now. 2 or 3 plans are in our mind, yet we are not sure yet which it is that our Lord intends. After Mass, we shall communicate to you that which he shall show us according to his will. We beg of you to say Mass also, immediately, for our intention. Whatever must be done quickly. The matter of the Cardinal Dolgorovsky you may leave until later. But we wish to hear the result of your inquiries, especially in London, before midday. Benedicat et omnipotens Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus. Amen, murmured the priest, reading it from the sheet. Part 3. The little chapel in the house below was scarcely more dignified than the other rooms. Of ornaments, except those absolutely essential to the liturgy and devotion, there were none. In the plaster of the walls were indented in slight relief the 14 stations of the cross. A small stone image of the Mother of God stood in the corner, with an ironwork candlestick before it. And on the solid uncarved stone altar, raised on a stone step, stood 6 more iron candlesticks and an iron crucifix. A tabernacle, also of iron, shrouded by linen curtains, stood beneath the cross. A small stone slab projected from the wall served as a credence. There was but one window, and this looked into the court, so that the eyes of strangers might not penetrate. It seemed to the Syrian priest, as he went about his business, laying out the vestment and the little sacristy that opened out at one side of the altar, preparing the cruets, and the stripping the coverings from the altar cloth, that even that slight work was wearying. There was a certain oppression in the air. As to how far that was the result of his broken rest, he did not know, but he feared that it was one more of those sirocco days that threatened. That yellowish tinge of dawn had not passed with the sun rising. Even now, as he went noiselessly on his bare feet between the predella and the prie-dieu, where the silent white figure was still motionless, he caught now and again, above the roof across the tiny court, a glimpse of that faint, sand-tinged sky that was the promise of beat and heaviness. He finished at last, lighted the candles, genuflected, and stood with bowed head, waiting for the Holy Father to rise from his knees. A servant's footstep sounded in the court, coming across to hear Mass, and simultaneously the Pope rose and went towards the sacristy, where the red vestments of God who came by fire were laid ready for the sacrifice. Sylvester's bearing at Mass was singularly unostentatiousness. He moved as swiftly as any young priest. His voice was quite even and quite low, and his pace neither rapid nor pompous. According to tradition, he occupied half an hour ab amicto an amictum, and even in the tiny empty chapel he observed to keep his eyes always downcast. And yet this Syrian never served his Mass without a thrill of something resembling fear. It was not only his knowledge of the awful dignity of this simple celebrant, but, although he could not have expressed it, there was an aroma of an emotion about the vestmented figure that affected him almost physically, an entire absence of self-consciousness, and in its place the consciousness of some other presence, a perfection of manner, even in the smallest details, that could only arise from absolute recollection. Even in Rome, in the old days, it had been one of the sights of Rome to see Father Franklin say Mass. Seminary students on the eve of ordination were sent to that site to learn the perfect manner and method. Today all was as usual, but at the communion the priest looked up suddenly at the moment when the host had been consumed, with half expression that either a sound or a gesture had invited it. And, as he looked, his heart began to beat, thick and convulsive at the base of his throat. Yet, to the outward eyes there was nothing unusual. The figure stood there with a bowed head, the chin resting on the tips of his long fingers, the body absolutely upright, standing with that curious light pose as if no weight rested upon their feet. But to the inner sense something was apparent. The Syrian could not in the least formulate it to himself. But afterwards he reflected that he had stared, expecting some visible or audible manifestation to take place. It was an impression that might be described under the terms of either light or sound. At any instant, that delicate, vivid force, that to the eyes of the soul burned beneath the red chasuble and the white alb, might have suddenly welled outwards under the appearance of a gush of radiant light, rendering luminous not only the clear brown flesh seen beneath the white hair, but the very texture of the coarse, dead, stained stuffs that swathed the rest of the body. Or it might have shown itself in the strain of a long chord on strings, or wind, as if the mystical union of the dedicated soul with the ineffable Godhead and humanity of Jesus Christ generated such a sound as ceaselessly flows out with the river of life from beneath the throne of the Lamb. Or yet, once more, it might have declared itself under the guise of a perfume, the very essence of distilled sweetness, such a scent as that which, streaming out through the gross tabernacle of a saint's body, is to those who observe it as the breath of heavenly roses. Moments passed in that hush of purity and peace. Sounds came and went outside, the rattle of a cart far away, the sawing of the first cicada in the coarse grass 20 yards away from beyond the wall. Someone behind the priest was breathing short and thick under the pressure of an intolerable emotion, and yet the figure stood there still, without a movement or sway to break the carved motionlessness of the alb folds, or the perfect poise of the white-shod feet. When he moved at last to uncover the precious blood, to lay his hands on the altar and adore, it was as if a statue has stirred into life. To the server it was very nearly as a shock. Again, when the chalice was empty, that first impression reasserted itself. The human and the external died in the embrace of the divine and invisible, and once more silence lived and glowed. And again, as the spiritual energy sank back again into its origin, Sylvester stretched out the chalice. With knees that shook and eyes wide in expectation, the priest rose, adored, and went to the credence. It was customary after the Pope's Mass that the priest himself should offer the sacrifice in his presence. But today, so soon as the investments had been laid one by one on the rough chest, Sylvester turned to the priest. "Presently," he said softly, "go up, Father, at once to the roof and tell the cardinal to be ready. I shall come in 5 minutes." It was surely a Sirocco day, thought the priest, as he came up on that flat roof. Overhead, instead of the clear blue proper to that hour of the morning, a pale yellow sky, darkening even to brown at the horizon. Tabor, before him, hung distant and somber, seen through the impalpable atmosphere of sand. And across the plain, as he glanced behind him, beyond the white streak of Nain, Nothing was visible except the pale outline of the tops of the hills against the sky. Even at this morning hour, too, the air was hot and breathless, broken only by the slow, stifling lift of the southwestern breeze that, blowing across countless miles of sand beyond far-away Egypt, gathered up the heat of a huge waterless continent, and was pouring it, with scarcely a streak of sea to soften its malignity, on this poor strip of land. Carmel, too, as he turned again, was swathed about its base with mist, half dry and half damp, and above showed its long bullhead running out defiantly against the western sky. The very table as he touched it was dry and hot to the hand. By midday the steel would be intolerable. He pressed the lever and waited, pressed it again, and waited again. There came the answering ring, and he tapped across the 80 miles of air that His Eminence's presence was required at once. A minute or two passed, and then, after another rap of the bell, a line flicked out on a new white sheet. "I am here. Is it His Holiness?" He felt a hand upon his shoulder and turned to see Sylvester, hooded and in white, behind his chair. "Tell him yes. Ask him if there is further news." The Pope went to the chair once more and sat down, and a minute later the priest, with growing excitement, read out the answers. "Inquiries are pouring in. Many expect your Holiness to issue a challenge. My secretaries have been occupied since 4 o'clock. The anxiety is indescribable. Some are denying that they have a pope. Something must be done at once." "Is that all?" asked the Pope. Again the priest read out the answer. "Yes and no. The news is true. It will be enforced immediately. Unless a step is taken immediately, there will be widespread and final apostasy." "Very good," murmured the Pope in his official voice. "Now listen carefully, Eminence." He was silent for a moment, his fingers joined beneath his chin, just now at Mass. Then he spoke. "We are about to place ourselves unreservedly in the hands of God. Human prudence must no longer restrain us. We command you, then, using all discretion that is possible, to communicate these wishes of ours to the following persons under the strictest secrecy, and to no others whatsoever. And for this service you are to employ messengers, taken from the order of Christ crucified, 2 for each message, which is not to be committed to writing in any form. The members of the Sacred College, numbering 12, the metropolitans and patriarchs throughout the entire world, numbering 22, the generals of the religious orders, the societies of Jesus, the friars, the monks ordinary, and the monks contemplative, 4. These persons, 38 in number, with the chaplain of your Eminence, who shall act as notary, and my own who shall assist him, and ourself, 41 all told. These persons are to present themselves here at our palace of Nazareth not later than the eve of Pentecost. We feel ourselves unwilling to decide the steps necessary to be taken with reference to the new decree, except we first hear the counsel of our advisers, and give them an opportunity of communicating freely one with another. These words, as we have spoken them, are to be forwarded to all those persons whom we have named, and your Eminence will further inform them that our deliberations will not occupy more than 4 days. As regards the questions of provisioning the council and all matters of that kind, your Eminence will dispatch today the chaplain of whom we have spoken, whom with my own chaplain will at once set about preparations, and your Eminence will yourself follow, appointing Father Marabout to act in your absence, not later than 4 days hence. Finally, to all who have asked explicit directions in the face of this new decree, communicate this one sentence, and no more. Lose not your confidence, which hath a great reward, for yet a little while, and he that is to come will come, and will not delay. Sylvester the Bishop, servant of the servants of God. Chapter 3, Part 1. Oliver Brand stepped out from the conference hall in Westminster on the Friday evening, so soon as the business was over and the plenipotentiaries had risen from the table, more concerned as to the effect of the news upon his wife than upon the world. He traced beginning of the change to the day 5 months ago when the President of the world had first declared the development of this policy. And while Oliver himself had yielded to that development, and from defending it in public had gradually convinced himself of its necessity, Mabel, for the first time in her life, had shown herself absolutely obstinate. The woman, to his mind, seemed to him to have fallen into some kind of insanity. Felsenburgh's declaration had been made a week or two after his acclamation at Westminster, and Mabel had received the news of it at first with absolute incredulity. Then, when there was no longer any doubts that he had declared the extermination of the supernaturalist to be a possible necessity, there had been a terrible scene between husband and wife. She had said that she had been deceived, that the world's hope was a monstrous mockery, that the reign of universal peace was as far away as ever, that Felsenburgh had betrayed his trust and broken his word. There had been an appalling scene. He did not even now like to recall it to his imagination. She had quieted after a while, but his arguments, delivered with infinite patience, seemed to produce very little effect. She settled down into silence, hardly answering him. One thing only seemed to touch her, and that was when he spoke of the President himself. It was becoming plain to him that she was but a woman after all, at the mercy of a strong personality, but utterly beyond the reach of logic. He was very much disappointed, yet he trusted to time to cure her. The government of England had taken swift and skillful steps to reassure those who, like Mabel, recoiled from the inevitable logic of the new policy. An army of speakers traversed the country, defending and explaining. The press was engineered with extraordinary adroitness, and it was possible to say that there was not a person among the millions of England who had not easy access to the government's defense. Briefly, shorn of rhetoric, their arguments were as follows, and there was no doubt that, on the whole, they had the effect of quieting the amazed revolt of the more sentimental minds. Peace, it was pointed out, had for the first time in the world's history become a universal fact. There was no longer one state, however small, whose interests were not identical with those of one of the three divisions of the world of which it was a dependency. and that first stage had been accomplished nearly half a century ago. But the second stage, the reunion of these three divisions under a common head, an infinitely greater achievement than the former, since the conflicting interests were incalculably more vast, this had been consummated by a single person, who, it appeared, had emerged from humanity at the very instant when such a character was demanded. It was surely not much to ask that those on whom these benefits had come should assent to the will and judgment of him through whom they had come. This, then, was an appeal to faith. The second main argument was addressed to reason. Persecution, as all enlightened persons confessed, was the method of a majority of savages who desired to force a set of opinions upon a minority who did not spontaneously share them. Now the peculiar malevolence of persecution in the past lay, not in the employment of force, but in the abuse of it. That any one kingdom should dictate religious opinions to a minority of its members was an intolerable tyranny, for no one state possessed the right to lay down universal laws, the contrary to which might be held by its neighbor. This, however, disguised, was nothing else than the individualism of nations, a heresy even more disastrous to the commonwealth of the world than the individualism of the individual. But with the arrival of the universal community of interests, the whole situation was changed. The single personality of the human race had succeeded to the incoherence of divided units, and with that consummation, which might be compared to the coming of age, an entirely new set of rights had come into being. The human race was now a single entity, with a supreme responsibility towards itself. There were no longer any private rights at all, such as had certainly existed in the period previous to this. Man now possessed dominion over every cell which composed his mystical body, and where any such cell asserted itself to the detriment of the body, the rights of the whole were unqualified. And there was no religion but one that claimed the equal rights of universal jurisdiction, and that the Catholic. The sects of the East, while each retained characteristics of its own, had yet found in the new man the incarnation of their ideals, and had therefore given in their allegiance to the authority of the whole body, of whom he was the head. But the very essence of the Catholic religion was treason to the very idea of man. Christians directed their homage to a supposed supernatural being, who was not only, so they claimed, outside the world, but positively transcended it. Christians, then, leaving aside the mad fable of the Incarnation, which might very well be suffered to die of its own folly, deliberately severed themselves from that body of which by human generation they had been made members. They were as mortified limbs yielding themselves to the domination of an outside force, other than that which was their only life, and by that very act imperiled the entire body. This madness, then, was the one crime which still deserved the name. Murder, theft, rape, even anarchy itself, were as trifling faults compared to this monstrous sin, for while these injured indeed the body, they did not strike at its heart. Individuals suffered, and therefore those minor criminals deserved restraint, but the very life was not struck at. The But in Christianity there was a poison actually deadly. Every cell that became infected with it was infected in that very fiber that bound it to the spring of life. This, and this alone, was the supreme crime of high treason against man, and nothing but complete removal from the world could be an adequate remedy. These, then, were the main arguments addressed to that section of the world which still recoiled from the deliberate utterance of Felsenburgh, and their success had been remarkable. Of course, the logic, in itself indisputable, had been dressed up in a variety of costumes gilded with rhetoric, flushed with passion, and it had done its work in such a manner that as summer drew on, Felsenburgh had announced privately that he proposed to introduce a bill which should carry out of its logical conclusion the policy of which he had spoken. Now this, too, had been accomplished. Part 2. Oliver let himself into his house, and went straight upstairs to Mabel's room. It would not do to let her hear the news from any but his own lips. She was not there, and on inquiry heard that she had gone out an hour before. He was disconcerted at this. The decree had been signed half an hour earlier, and in answer to an inquiry from Lord Pemberton, it had been stated that there was no longer any reason for secrecy, and that the decision might be communicated to the press. Oliver had hurried away immediately in order to make sure that Mabel should hear the news from him, and now she was out, and at any moment the placards might tell her of what had been done. He felt extremely uneasy, but for another hour or so was ashamed to act. Then he went to the tube and asked another question or two, but the servant had no idea of Mabel's movements. It might be she had gone to the church. Sometimes she did at this hour. He sent the woman off to see, and himself sat down again in the window seat of his wife's room, staring out disconsolately at the wide array of roofs in this golden sunset light that seemed to his eyes to be strangely beautiful this evening. The sky was not that pure gold which had been every night during this last week. There was a touch of rose in it, and this extended across the entire vault so far as he could see from west to east. He reflected on what he had lately read in an old book to the effect that the abolition of smoke had certainly changed evening colors for the worse. There had been a couple of severe earthquakes, too, in America. He wondered whether there was any connection. Then his thoughts flew back to Mabel. It was about 10 minutes before he heard her footstep on the stairs, and as he stood up she came in. There was something in her face that told him that she knew everything, and his heart sickened at her pale rigidity. There was no fury there, nothing but white, hopeless despair, and an immense determination. Her lips showed a straight line, and her eyes, beneath her summer hat, seemed contracted to pinpricks. She stood there, closing the door mechanically behind her, and made no further movement towards him. "Is it true?" she said. Oliver drew one steady breath and sat down. "Is what true, my dear?" "It is true," she said again, "and all our to be questioned as to whether they believe in God, and to be killed if they confess it? Oliver licked his lips. You put it very harshly, he said. The question is whether the world has a right. She made a sharp movement with her head. It is true, then. And you signed it? My dear, I begged you not to make a scene. I am tired out, and I will not answer that until you have heard what I have to say. Say it, then. Sit down, then. She shook her head. Very well, then. Well, this is the point. The world is one now, not many. Individualism is dead. It died when Felsenburgh became president of the world. You surely see that absolutely new conditions prevail now. There has never been anything like it before. You know all this as well as I do. Again came that jerk of impatience. Will you please hear me out? He said wearily. Well, now that this has happened, there is a new morality. It is exactly like a child coming to the age of reason. We are obliged, therefore, to see that this continues, that there is no going back, no mortification, that all the limbs are in good health. If thy hand offend thee, cut it off, said Jesus Christ. Well, that is what we say. Now, for anyone to say that they believe in God, I doubt very much whether there is anyone who really does believe, or understand what it means. But for anyone even to say so is the very worst crime conceivable. It is high treason. But there is going to be no violence. It will all be quiet and merciful. Why, you have always approved of euthanasia, as we all do. Well, it is that will be used. And once more she made a little movement with her hand. The rest of her was like an image. Is this any use? She asked. Oliver stood up. He could not bear the hardness of her voice. Mabel, my darling. For an instant her lips shook. Then again she looked at him with eyes of ice. I don't want that, she said. It is of no use. Then you did sign it. Oliver had a sense of miserable desperation as he looked back at her. He would infinitely have preferred that she had stormed and wept. Mabel, he cried again, then you did sign it. I did sign it, he said at last. She turned and went towards the door. He sprang after her. Mabel, where are you going? Then, for the first time in her life, she lied to her husband frankly and fully. I am going to rest a little, she said. I shall see you presently at supper. He still hesitated, but she met his eyes, pale indeed, but so honest that he fell back. Very well, my dear. Mabel, try to understand. He came down to supper half an hour later, primed with logic, and even kindled with emotion. The argument seemed to him now so utterly convincing. Granted the premises that they both accepted and lived by, the conclusion was simply inevitable. He waited a minute or two, and at last went to the tube that communicated with the servants' quarters. Where is Mrs. Brand? He said. There was an instant silence, and then the answer came. She left the house half an hour ago, sir. I thought you knew. 3. That same evening Mr. Francis was very busy in his office over the details connected with the festival of sustenance that was to be celebrated on the 1st of July. It was the first time that that particular ceremony had taken place, and he was anxious that it should be as successful as its predecessors. There were few differences between this and the other, and it was necessary that the ceremoniarii should be fully instructed. So, with his model before him, a miniature replica of the interior of the abbey, with tiny dummy figures on blocks that could be shifted this way and that, he was engaged in adding in a minute ecclesiastical hand rubrical notes to his copy of the order of proceedings. When the porter therefore rang up a little after 21 o'clock that a lady wished to see him, he answered rather brusquely down the tube that it was impossible. But the bell rang again, and to his impatient question, the reply came up that it was Mrs. Brand below, and that she did not ask for more than 10 minutes' conversation. This was quite another matter. Oliver Brand was an important personage, and his wife therefore had significance, and Mr. Francis apologized, gave directions that she was to come to his anteroom, and rose, sighing, from his dummy abbey and officials. She seemed very quiet this evening, he thought, as he shook hands with her a minute earlier. She wore her veil down, so that he could not see her face very well, but her voice seemed to lack its usual vivacity. "I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Francis," she said. "I only wanted to ask you a couple of questions." He smiled at her encouragingly. "Mr. Brand, no doubt." "No," she said. "Mr. Brand has not sent me. It was entirely my own affair. You will see my reasons presently. I will begin at once. I know I must not keep you." It all seemed rather odd, he thought, but no doubt he would understand soon. "First," she said, "I think you used to know Father Franklin. He became a cardinal, didn't he?" Mr. Francis assented, smiling. "Do you know if he is alive?" "No," he said. "He is dead. He was in Rome, you know, at the time of its destruction." "Ah, are you sure?" "Quite sure. Only one cardinal escaped, Steinmann. He was hanged in Berlin, and the Patriarch of Jerusalem died a week or two later." "Ah, very well. Well, now, here is an odd question. I ask for a particular reason which I cannot explain, but you will soon understand. It is this. Why do Catholics believe in God?" He was so much taken aback that for a moment he sat staring. "Yes," she said tranquilly, "it is a very odd question. But—" she hesitated. "Well, I will tell you," she said. "The fact is that I have a friend who is in danger from this new law. I want to be able to argue with her, and I must know her side. You are the only priest, I mean who has been a priest, whom I ever knew, except Father Franklin. So I thought you would not mind telling me." Her voice was entirely natural. There was not a tremor or a falter in it. Mr. Francis smiled genially, rubbing his hands softly together. "Ah," he said, "yes, I see. Well, that is a very large question. Would not tomorrow, perhaps—" "I only want just the shortest answer," she said. "It is really important for me to know at once. You see, this new law comes into force," he nodded. "Well, very briefly, I should say this. Catholics say that God can be perceived by reason, that from the arrangements of the world they can deduce that there must have been an arranger, a mind, you understand. Then they say that they deduce other things about God, that he is love, for example, because of happiness. And the pain, she interrupted. He smiled again. Yes, that is the point. That is the weak point. But what do they say about that? Well, briefly, they say that pain is the result of sin, and sin. You see, I know nothing at all, Mr. Francis. Well, sin is the rebellion of man's will against God's. What do they mean by that? Well, you see, they say that God wanted to be loved by his creatures, so that he made them free. Otherwise they could not really love. But if they were free, it means that they could, if they liked, refuse to love and obey God, and that what is called sin. You see what nonsense. She jerked her head a little. Yes, yes, she said, but I really want to get at what they think. Well then, that is all? Mr. Francis pursed his lips. Scarcely, he said. That is hardly more than what they call natural religion. Catholics believe much more than that. Well? My dear Mrs. Brand, it is impossible to put in a few words. But, in brief, they believe that God became man, that Jesus was God, and that he did this in order to save them from sin by dying. By bearing pain, you mean? Yes, by dying. Well, what they call the incarnation is really the point. Everything else flows from that. And, once a man believes that, I must confess that all the rest follows, even down to scapulars and holy water. Mr. Francis, I don't understand a word you're saying. He smiled indulgently. Of course not, he said. It is all incredible nonsense. But, you know, I really did believe it all once. But it's unreasonable, she said. He made a little demurring sound. Yes, he said, in one sense, of course it is. Utterly unreasonable. But in another sense, she leaned forward suddenly, and he could catch the glint of her eyes beneath her white veil. Ah, she said, almost breathlessly, this is what I want to hear. Now tell me how they justify it. He paused an instant, considering. Well, he said slowly, as far as I remember, they say that there are other faculties besides those of reason. They say, for example, that the heart sometimes finds out things that the reason cannot. Intuitions, you see. For instance, they say that all things such as self-sacrifice and chivalry and even art all come from the heart, that reason comes with them, in rules of technique, for instance, but that it cannot prove them. They are quite apart from that. I think I see. Well, they say that religion is like that. In other words, they practically confess that it is merely a matter of emotion. He paused again, trying to be fair. Well, perhaps they would not say that, although it is true. But briefly, well, they say there is a thing called faith, a kind of deep conviction unlike anything else, supernatural, which God is supposed to give to people who desire it, to people who pray for it, and lead good lives, and so on. And this faith? Well, this faith, acting upon what they call evidences, this faith makes them absolutely certain that there is a God, that he was made man and so forth, with the church and all the rest of it. They say, too, that this is further proved by the fact that their religion has had in the world, and by the way it explains man's nature to himself. You see, it was just a case of self-suggestion. He heard her sigh and stopped. Is that any clearer, Mrs. Brand? Thank you very much, she said. It certainly is clearer. And is it true that Christians have died for this faith, whatever it is? Oh, yes, thousands and thousands, just as Mohammedans have for theirs. The Mohammedans believe in God, too, don't they? Well, they did, and I suppose that a few do now, but very few. The rest have become esoteric, as they say. And which would you say were the most highly evolved people, East or West? Oh, West, undoubtedly. The East thinks a good deal, but it doesn't act much, and that always leads to confusion, even to stagnation of thought. And Christianity certainly has been the religion of the West up to 100 years ago. Oh, yes. She was silent then, and Mr. Francis had time again to reflect on how very odd this all was. She certainly must be very much attended to this Christian friend of hers. Then she stood up, and he rose with her. Thank you so much, Mr. Francis. Then that is the kind of outline. Well, yes, so far as one could put it in a few words. Thank you. I mustn't keep you. He went with her toward the door, but within a yard of it she stopped. And you, Mr. Francis, you were brought all up in this. Does it ever come back to you? He smiled. Never, he said, except as a dream. How do you account for that, then? If it is all self-suggestion, you have had 30 years of it. She paused, and for a moment he hesitated what to answer. How would your old fellow Catholics account for it? They would say that I had forfeited light, that faith was withdrawn. And you? Again he paused. I should say that I made a stronger self-suggestion the other way. I see. Good night, Mr. Francis. She would not let him come down the lift with her, so when he had seen the smooth box drop noiselessly below the level, he went back again to his model of the Abbey and the little dummy figures. But before he began to move these things about again, he sat for a moment or two with pursed lips, staring.